Hey, welcome to SpaceX Daily, episode 30, coming to you from Vancouver. It's July 12th, 2026. Plenty moving across Starship, Falcon, and Starlink today. Starship's July 16th flight will attempt the first orbital deployment of Starlink V3 satellites, directly testing the upgraded laser links and mass capacity needed for the next phase of constellation growth. A Falcon 9 booster completed its 35th flight and deployed 29 Starlink satellites. KeepTrack reports the mission extended the prior 34-flight record on the same hardware family. The flight supplies fresh data on structural fatigue and life limits, while Starship development proceeds in parallel. Regular listeners tracking Falcon launch cadence and reuse since the July 11th episode will note this keeps the annual launch rate ceiling question active. Port photos from July 7th through 9th show standard recovery procedures at the dock with the transport barge still in position. SpaceX confirmed July 16th as the target date for Starship's 13th integrated flight test. The mission will fly 20 Starlink V3 satellites and test upgraded laser links, mass capacity, and orbital operations ahead of refueling demonstrations. Report.az and finance.bigo.com both cite the SpaceX site for the explicit July 16th window. Regular listeners will recall the July 11th coverage of ongoing Starbase preparations. This date sets the next concrete milestone for full reuse goals. This marks the first time the upgraded V3 hardware flies on Starship rather than Falcon 9. The official SpaceX page for the 13th flight test outlines the planned orbital deployment sequence for the initial V3 satellites. India Today notes Starship remains the most powerful rocket scheduled to fly on that date. Basper reports the first Starlink V3 satellites have begun deployment with improved inter-satellite laser links that increase overall constellation capacity. Early data from the initial units will inform whether the new aperture and power systems deliver the expected per-satellite bandwidth gains. This step directly addresses the open question of direct-to-cell ramp and subscriber growth tracked since the July 11th episode. Report.az states that SpaceX confirmed the target date for Starship's 13th integrated flight test. The mission will build on the prior campaign by attempting orbital operations that move the program closer to refueling demonstrations. The announcement names July 16th explicitly as the window for the first Starlink V3 deployment attempt. Finance.bigo.com adds that the company set the July 16th window specifically to fly the initial Starlink V3 satellites on Starship. This integrates the two programs by using the larger vehicle to place the upgraded satellites into orbit. Success here would advance both the Starship reuse timeline and the Starlink capacity expansion tracked in recent episodes. The target date aligns with the separate SpaceX announcement naming the same July 16th slot for Flight 13. India Today coverage confirms Starship Flight 13 will carry 20 Starlink satellites as its primary payload. The vehicle is described as the most powerful rocket scheduled to fly on that date. This marks the first time the upgraded V3 variant flies aboard the full Starship stack rather than Falcon 9. The official SpaceX page for the 13th flight test was released with details on the July 16th target. The page outlines the planned orbital deployment sequence for the initial Starlink V3 satellites. This continues the Starship program arc last covered on July 11th, where preparations at Starbase were noted as the immediate focus. SpaceX entered the NASDAQ 100 index following the recent IPO and concurrent hardware milestones on both Starship and Falcon 9. MSN reports index inclusion reflects the combined operational cadence of the two vehicles. The timing coincides with the 35th Falcon 9 booster flight and the confirmed Starship Flight 13 target. SpaceX SPCX announced the $60 billion acquisition of Cursor days after its own IPO, raising questions about capital allocation and integration complexity. The deal size relative to recent revenue figures could pressure near-term cash flow if synergies take longer than expected to materialize. Observers will watch the August float unlock for any early signs of how the market prices the combined entity. Community members posted that the official Starship Flight 13 page had been released on the SpaceX site. r/SpaceX Lounge threads quickly filled with users comparing the listed objectives to prior flight test pages. Several commenters highlighted the explicit mention of Starlink V3 deployment as the distinguishing element versus earlier flights. Observers noted Jacqueline remaining in the area, while aerial and ground photos documented routine post-flight activity without new anomalies. One thread examined how the 20-satellite manifest compares with earlier Starlink payload projections. r/SpaceX Lounge users shared port pictures from July 7 to 9 showing standard booster recovery procedures at the dock, along with the transport barge still holding position. The post received multiple comments discussing visible hardware markings without new anomalies. Users discussed the implications of the July 16th target date appearing simultaneously in multiple independent reports. Participants noted the shift from Falcon 9 to Starship for the V3 satellites as the key change. Worth keeping an eye on the SI billion-dollar acquisition of Cursor announced days after the NASDAQ listing. On the AI front, SpaceX purchased Cursor for $60 billion shortly after its NASDAQ listing, folding the AI code editor into the broader Musk compute stack. The move places Grok models at the center of developer tooling distribution while tying Cursor's engineering resources to SpaceX and xAI infrastructure planning. No further details on post-acquisition roadmap or compute allocation were released in the announcement. The $60 billion acquisition of Cursor was announced days after the NASDAQ listing. From an engineering standpoint, the payload bay geometry on Starship Flight 13 must accommodate the V3 satellite's new mass and power budgets, while preserving margin for the deorbit burn. The core constraint remains how much dry mass can be lifted without cutting into propellant reserves needed for the target orbit. Moving the first V3 satellites onto Starship instead of Falcon 9 tests whether the larger fairing volume and higher throw capacity can lower the per-satellite cost floor that currently equals raw materials plus solar cells plus laser terminals. If the V3 design scales the aperture while reusing the phased array architecture, marginal cost per additional bit of throughput drops once launch price per kilogram falls below the Falcon 9 baseline. The open variable is how many V3 units fit without exceeding center of mass limits that affect booster return performance. Post-flight mass-to-orbit numbers will show whether satellite-side mass reductions or vehicle-side propellant margins need the next redesign cycle. The Falcon 9 booster's 35th flight supplies a live data set on structural fatigue after repeated thermal cycles and landing loads. Engineers track residual wall thickness after multiple re-entries, seal integrity at the intertank joints, and cumulative grid fin actuator cycles. Because the vehicle returns successfully, the next open measurement is how much margin remains before the next overhaul or retirement decision. That margin directly informs the annual launch rate ceiling still listed as an unresolved question for the Falcon program. The decision to fly the first V3 satellites on Starship also tests integration between satellite bus design and launch vehicle fairing envelope. V3 satellites carry larger solar arrays and more capable laser terminals that increase both mass and deployed volume. Starship's 9-meter diameter fairing removes the packaging constraints that forced earlier Starlink generations into tighter stowed configurations on Falcon 9. Post-flight telemetry on satellite separation dynamics and subsequent orbit-raising propellant use will reveal whether the extra volume allows simpler deployment mechanisms or simply consumes the newly available mass budget. And a quick market note, SPCX closed at $145.30, down 4.6%. Before we go, Starship's next flight keeps the entire stack moving forward. And that's a wrap on today's SpaceX developments. SPCX is trading at $145.30, down 4.6%. Share this with a fellow spaceflight fan if you found it useful, and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's episode. I'm Patrick in Vancouver. See you next time. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Fascinating Frontiers, the most fascinating news from space and science. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. Live dashboards, TSLA, SpaceX launches, the investing scoreboard are all at naranetwork.com/data. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.